Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots of big stories breaking this Monday morning. Some very troubling new reporting and developments out of Ukraine that we have to update you on. You know, this is starting to fall off of the media's radar a little bit, just at the moment when it almost is at its most dangerous. So we will bring you all of those updates. We also have some new indications of how the politics might play out in terms of the imminent overturning of Roe versus Wade, Republicans doing themselves no favors. Also some polling indicating that, you know, the picture might be a little bit complicated in terms of the midterms. We'll tell you about that. Also, a pitch deck revealed from Elon Musk, giving us some insights into what his plans for Twitter might be. Also, some revelations about some less than savory sources of funding.
Yes, not great.
He has relied on, including the country of Qatar,
yes.
Not known for their free speech commitment. No. But we'll tell you about that. We also have news about a new press secretary coming into the White House, and Jen Psaki pressed on, you know, her negotiations behind the scenes while she's still doing the current job and taking a new job with a media organization. Also, a pretty stunning moment from Senator Rand Paul that we wanted to share with you, talking about this new, like, Ministry of Truth situation. Pretty good comments from him.
It was great.
Actually.
I thought he did a great job.
I like seeing it. We also have Mohamed Younis in. He is the head of polling at Gallup. He's going to talk to us more about abortion polling and what that looks like going forward. But we wanted to start with some very troubling developments this morning in terms of reporting of the U.S. involvement in Ukraine's prosecution of the war with Russia. Let's go ahead and throw these dueling tear sheets up on the screen here from the New York Times. They were the ones who were sort of at the forefront of this reporting. So two pieces here. Number one, U.S. intelligence is helping Ukraine kill Russian generals, officials say, and also U.S. intelligence helped Ukraine strike Russian flagship, officials say. So much more hands-on involvement in this war than had previously been reported. And Saagar, there had been some indications before. We'd gotten these little indications that maybe we were helping them with targeting, helping provide intelligence. You and I had talked about it. It honestly sort of flew under the radar of most of the media. Well, now we have specific details about just how instrumental the U.S.'s backing of Ukraine has been in some of these major, significant events in terms of this war. Let me read you a little bit from the reporting on our assistance in helping to target and ultimately kill these Russian generals. They say the U.S. has provided intelligence about Russian units that has allowed Ukrainians to target and kill many of the Russian generals who have died in action in the Ukraine war. Ukrainian officials say they have killed approximately 12 generals on the front lines, a number that has astonished military analysts. The targeting help is part of a classified effort by the Biden administration to provide real-time battlefield intelligence to Ukraine. That intelligence also includes anticipated Russian troop movements gleaned from recent American assessments of Moscow's secret battle plans. And in addition, the U.S. provided intelligence that helped, this is from that second tear sheet, Ukrainian forces locate and strike the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet last month, another sign that the administration is easing its self-imposed limitations on how far it will go in helping Ukraine fight Russia. We covered when that flagship went down.
It's a big deal.
And this was a huge deal. It has been covered extensively in Russian media. They engaged in an elaborate cover-up to try to deny that it was actually, you know, Ukrainian forces that struck and ultimately brought down this ship. They also tried to cover up the deaths that were involved. They tried to claim, oh, there was a fire on board and everybody's fine and we towed it to safety, no big deal. But this was a huge blow to Russia. And so, again, without the U.S. public's involvement in any sort of debate, we are getting ourselves more and more and deeper into this conflict and providing direct assistance in some of the most significant Ukrainian hits on Russia that we have seen so far. This is extraordinarily significant when you consider how the Russians are going to view this involvement. I mean, are they really going to distinguish between us, you know, not being directly boots on the ground, considering how far in we are at this point?
You know, actually, what troubles me the most about this is it's very clear, you and I know how this town works. This was a strategic leak by the U.S. intelligence community because they're bragging about it. They're like, yeah, we're helping kill these generals. We're helping. And I'm like, hey, why don't you shut up? Because, look, I don't think that Russia assumed that this wasn't going on. They probably already knew based upon this. But it's within the realm of the proxy war. I'm not condoning it. You know, I still think that we should try our best in order to not get involved in these types of things. But there was probably a sense of realism. I just want people to remember this. Do you remember the Russian bounty story that ended up being completely fake, where there was reporting that Russia had put bounties on American soldiers and was helping the Taliban kill them? At that time, several members of the U.S. Senate called for immediately retaliating against Russians. And Ben Sass specifically said that we should personally assassinate GRU agents on the ground in Afghanistan. Well, this opens up the exact same response from Russia, assuming that they think in the same way in Moscow that they do in Washington, D.C. Is there any real reason to distinguish the two? I mean, look, when you're openly bragging about killing your enemy's generals, these are very significant events, okay? Generals don't just die in combat all that much. I actually went back and I was looking back. You know, U.S. generals, it's incredibly rare in order to die in warfare in the post-World War II era. The Russian army is organized a little bit differently, but still, you know, you're losing up to 10 generals. I mean, these are long, experienced, revered members within both Russian society and the Russian military. Killing those people is going to engender a significant response, and then on top of that, you know, you kill the warship. Now, obviously, Ukraine is at war with that nation, so that's within the bounds of conflict. But us opening and saying, oh, well, we're helping a lot of this facilitate. I also, if you look at the headlines of these, U.S. intelligence is helping Ukraine kill Russian generals and warships, it's clear the intel community wants to get the credit for this and kind of in the press and boast with the population, but they are just overreading the fact that there could still be yet a response from Moscow. I mean, look, within the realm of the gray war, you know, if we are helping facilitate this, we still have soldiers who are in Syria. If those guys start getting blown up by sophisticated IEDs, well, like, that's a possible response. Iran did that to our troops when we were in Iraq, and there's not a lot that we could do about that. We have troops all over the globe where Russia is also forward deployed. So we just have to consider that this could have a significant blowback, and are we ready in order to suffer that consequence?
That is exactly right. And there's a few things going on here. I mean, to me, the most important part of this story is the macro trend of how we just keep going further and further and further and further, and with no public debate whatsoever. Right. And if there's one thing the American public has been clear about, it's the fact that they do not want to be in a war with Russia.
Yes.
You know, they definitely have tons of compassion, sympathy for the Ukrainian cause. They want to help Ukraine. They want to stand with Ukraine. But every single poll, no matter how you ask it, people are very clear. They do not want to be at war with Russia. And yet, while we weren't really paying attention, while the media was focused on other things, you now have a member of Congress, Seth Moulton, a Democrat, outright admitting that, yeah, at this point, we basically are at war with Russia. Let's take a listen to that.
I only have 10 seconds left for each of you, if you could. But if they wrap this in the Senate with a Ukraine funding and a COVID funding, you guys okay with that, Congressman Moulton?
Look, I'm going to support it because it's the right thing to do for Ukraine. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of politics involved, and there will be domestic debates here at home about other policies and whatnot. But at the end of the day, we've got to realize we're at war. And we're not just at war to support the Ukrainians. We're fundamentally at war, although it's somewhat through a proxy, with Russia, and it's important that we win.
Fundamentally at war with Russia.
Yeah.
Did you vote on that? Did we have a public debate on that? Is that what you want? Because that's what we're being dragged into. And I know we've said it a million times. I'm not trying to be alarmist, but just remember what the stakes are. You're talking about a conflict between two nuclear-armed superpowers. This is extraordinarily dangerous. It's not anything that the American people want, and yet bit by bit by bit, this is where we've ended up. Trita Parsi had a great thread and a great article about all of this. Of course, we have a lot of respect for his foreign policy analysis here. And he said, Biden's dance with the media, publicly declaring a more ambitious U.S. objective in Ukraine, only to have it clarified by the White House hours later, has imperceptibly expanded America's goals in Ukraine with potentially disastrous consequences. The riskiest step has been to put the weakening of Russia ahead of the defense of Ukraine. This type of mission creep led to the U.S. staying in Afghanistan for 2 decades and turned an achievable counterterrorism operation into a doomed nation-building project. And he lays out the parallels here of how, listen, when we went into Afghanistan, it was, we're going to get the bad guys, we're going to get Osama bin Laden, and we're going to get out. And when we failed to do that, then suddenly you had all the people here who had a lot of money at stake in being engaged in Afghanistan and occupying in Afghanistan for literally forever is what they wanted. Then they started to get their hooks into it. They started to lay the groundwork for, oh no, it's not just Osama bin Laden. We want to do nation building. What about the women and the girls? What about spreading democracy and freedom around the globe? Next thing you know, it's 20 years later and we're still in Afghanistan. So Trita, Dr. Parsi is pointing here to a very similar mission creep, which is happening with no debate, where bit by bit by bit, we're getting even further in. And, you know, the other piece of this, there was a report coming from, it's actually Ukrainian Pravda, so a Ukrainian outlet here, that when Boris Johnson visited Kyiv, the key message that he was carrying was, we don't want you to negotiate a peace. We want to continue to have war with, we want this war against Russia to continue, because ultimately the goal is to weaken Russia, not to secure peace. That is not anything that the American people or, you know, people throughout the West ultimately wanted, and yet that appears to be exactly what our leaders are pushing.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more, Krystal. And, you know, just to put a cap on this, this was leaked to Ukrainian Pravda. Put this up there on the screen. So a Ukrainian-aligned media outlet says that closest sources close to Zelensky said that Boris Johnson, when he appeared in the Capitol, brought a simple message. Even if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreements on guarantees with Putin, the West is not. And this is exactly what I feared from the beginning, that for all of the talk in Washington of we support Ukraine, we support Ukraine, we support Ukraine, if we don't support them when they want to sign a separate peace with Russia, then you're full of it. Then you're actually fulfilling Congressman Moulton's declaration that you are at war with Russia. If our job is to support Ukraine, then we should try to save as many Ukrainian lives as possible within the dignity of what they want to undergo as a nation. If they want to fight on, so be it. If they don't want to fight on and they want to go towards peace, I think that we should personally support such an action if that's what they want to do. But for us to rule out a peace on our terms is insane, and you're actually just validating the Russian declaration that Ukraine is part of some great power proxy conflict instead of between these two nations. So I found that incredibly troubling, and I think the fact that it was leaked to a Ukrainian media outlet shows that inside Ukraine there's complicated feelings. You know, Zelensky, he's meeting with George W. Bush, which I don't know who his PR people are, but, you know, probably shouldn't do that. But, you know, he's meeting with Bush. He's, you know, on this media tour in Israel and here and everywhere. He's begging for weapons. He's gotten more weapons than, you know, any country, fourth most amount of military aid of all time since 1946 from the United States.
Cumulative, yes.
Cumulatively, in the last, 3 months that have been shipped over to that country. So he's been enormously successful. But, you know, if he wants an off-ramp, he also needs the West on board. And so the fact that they're leaking this, I think, is very, very significant, saying that they believe that the West does not believe in a path towards peace and that they may even have their own separate negotiations. I don't think we should have a goddamn thing to say about what happens here other than, what do you guys want? You want to fight? Okay, we'll help you out. But if you don't, let's go. Let's do everything humanly possible. And, you know, for us to have our own red lines in this thing only validates the worst of the Russian concerns and actually, you know, makes it so that this thing will not come to an end. And remember, there were, dozens of people killed in an airstrike just yesterday.
That's right.
War's not a joke, people. A lot of people die. A lot. We've already had thousands of people on both sides of the Russian and Ukrainian conflict, millions of displaced citizens. This is not something for us to just play around with. This is a serious thing.
That's exactly right. And according to this reporting, they say Johnson's position was that the collective West, which back in February had suggested Zelensky should surrender and flee, now felt that Putin was not really as powerful as they'd previously imagined, that there was a chance to, quote, press him. And sure enough, 3 days after Boris Johnson left for Britain, Putin went public and said talks with Ukraine had turned into a dead end. So there were some developments, publicly reported developments, that followed closely on the heels of Boris Johnson coming in and reportedly delivering this message that would indicate perhaps this is exactly what went down, that he showed up in Kyiv basically to say, listen, we want this to keep going. We don't want a negotiated peace with Russia at this point because we think Putin is weaker than we expected, and we want the opportunity to continue to weaken Russia. Very, very dangerous game, because this gets back to that whole idea, gambling for resurrection. Yes, this has not gone well for Russia. There is no doubt about it. Even with their new limited aims are not particularly going well in terms of this war right now. That doesn't mean that this isn't still a dangerous man with a lot of incredibly dangerous and potentially world-destroying weapons at his fingertips. So what happens when he's backed into a corner and when the West is out there, Ron Klain outright saying, we don't want Putin to have an off-ramp. Seth Moulton, congressman, outright saying, we are at war with Russia. What happens next? We do have a little bit of new reporting this morning. Let's go ahead and move on to this next part. So today, there was a lot of anticipation for what Putin and the Kremlin would do. It was Victory Day. Traditionally, military
It's a big day in Russia.
Big day in Russia, celebration of their victory over the Nazis, marches in the street, all that sort of stuff. And there was a particularly ominous sign that this event could be used to potentially announce a larger escalation or a larger civilian mobilization, so adding more soldiers into the fight. Let's go ahead and put this piece up on the screen from Reuters. The plan was for Putin to send what they describe as a doomsday warning by flying their doomsday plane roaming command center, which is designed to basically be the sort of mobile command center in the event of nuclear war. So what they say here is celebrations on Monday marking the 77th anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany. They were going to have this flyover, including that doomsday command plane, which would carry Russia's top brass, including Putin, in the event of a nuclear war. And it is packed with technology, but specific details are Russian state secrets. So there was, let's go ahead and put the New York Times tear sheet as well. They had a long article about the concerns from the West of what these parades and what these celebrations could be used to justify. They say it's a potent political strategy in a country that celebrates May 9th, Victory Day, as its most important secular holiday, one that appeals to the shared sacrifice of 27 billion Soviets killed in World War II. What they said is that Mr. Putin is expected to give a major speech at the Grand Military Parade on Red Square on Monday, with some analysts and Western officials anticipating he might officially declare war or call for a mass mobilization of the Russian public. On Sunday, the Kremlin said that Mr. Putin had sent a congratulatory telegram to the heads of the Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine. He declared Russians were, quote, fighting shoulder to shoulder to liberate their homeland from Nazi filth, and vowed that victory will be ours like in 1945. However, I talked to our friend Yegor this morning and got the report from the ground. Not only did they not fly the doomsday plane, but in most of the major cities, actually the entire sort of air show was grounded. Yeah. So they grounded the doomsday plane and all the rest of the, fighter jets and whatever else they were planning. Yeah. And in the speech, Yegor described it as sort of typical propaganda for Putin. No expansion,
I was about to read the translation.
Yeah, what you got for us?
No declaration of war, victory, or a general mobilization. And so the rough guide per this outline was that there was a degradation of Western morality, that NATO was going to attack us, but that Kiev was going to get nuclear weapons. We are fighting the Nazis. The Donbass is Russian. It's a continuation of the Great Patriotic War. Here's a military parade, and then that's pretty much it. So no grand declaration.
And that language is nothing new from Putin.
Not new whatsoever. So I was afraid, many people were, that this was going to be, some sort of escalation. I think it just shows you Russia is dramatically backed into a corner. They really don't have a lot more resources they can come to bear. And for all of the talk of the Russian population being on Putin's side, I don't think a lot of them are ready for a full-scale war, or for the civilian population to suffer even more so than they already have. So you put that together, and this could be seen as, I would say on balance, a probably best outcome for those who don't want to see an escalation in the East or in the war in general. It means that they'll be committed to the short-term possibility, to the current possibility. Now, that's not all to say a great thing. That still means that we will have probably a hot grade, mid-grade war happening in eastern Ukraine for a decade now, probably plus. So it's not like people aren't going to die, and this still won't be a significant conflict. But the days of wanting to conquer Kyiv are probably over.
Yeah.
The days of, now I'm not saying they can't do it. I'm saying within the current political possibility. Of course, if they want to mobilize their entire army, they could probably take it tomorrow, but it would take a tremendous loss of life. So politically, it seems that they have reached the exhaustive phase. That's probably a good thing, if you don't want to see even more escalate. The fact that they didn't fly the plane either is good, but I should note they did have the ICBMs in the parade, but they always do that for their thing. So
yeah, it is interesting too why they ground not just that plane, but they didn't do the air show altogether. So again, according to Yegor, they claimed that it was bad weather, but he said it was sunny. It was a perfect day, so it didn't make any sense. Possibly, there's fears that the Air Force has not been doing their job. Who knows what's going on with them? But that is noteworthy that they just grounded the whole thing. It's also noteworthy. There's reports from the BBC that there have been a number of military registration and enlistment offices that have been set on fire by anti-war activists.
There you go.
So you have, we've seen certainly some peaceful protests in the street, and very hard to tell overall what public sentiment is in Russia. But you have some significant civil disobedience here and just outright disobedience here in terms of pushing back on the war effort. So seem to be some signs that the politics are tricky and complicated and not straightforward for Putin at this point.
No, I think that's probably the best way to put it. And that the culmination of the parade that way is overall a definitely good on balance. Let's move on then to the final part here. We had to bring you this. Let's put this up there on the screen. The West has sent its best and its brightest to Ukraine on Mother's Day. I shouldn't make too much fun. For Jill Biden, the First Lady, I thought it was nice that she went over there.
Dr. Jill seems lovely.
Dr. Jill, that's right, in order to lift spirits for Mother's Day. But Bono and Trudeau accompanied her. Trudeau, of course, being another leader of a NATO nation. And, pretty significant there. Bono, I think, was representing the United Nations as a goodwill ambassador or something like that. So those three went over there in the context of broader Western declarations of sympathy. Of course, from a security situation, to have the First Lady visit Ukraine is incredibly a significant event. But we already sent our Secretary of State, so it's more a matter of goodwill. On the diplomatic front, let's put this up there on the screen because this is very important. G7 nations have now pledged to ban or phase out Russian oil. Of course, the G7 includes Germany, and that was always the number one concern of, well, what exactly are the Germans going to do here? Because they rely so much on Russian natural gas. So the European Union right now is getting about a quarter of its crude oil import from Russia. Now, what they are committing to with this declaration is to phase out Russian oil. And right now, they're still in talks to formalize that decision. So it's not 100%, declared exactly. The other reason why this matters, though, is that people forget this, is that Japan is also in the G7, and Japan is a major oil-consuming nation. So for Japan to say that they're going to phase out, both actually, it's an interesting kind of Asia-Pacific declaration of solidarity with the West. They try generally not to align themselves this way, but Japan, of course, also has its own history of war with Russia, and they're really just trying in order to get Western solidarity with them in the event that they end up in a conflict with China. So to see them come along with us in this way is actually pretty significant because they also import a decent amount of stuff from Russia in terms of production. So anyway, what I would say is that is probably the most significant diplomatic action in probably the last 2 months since the declaration of those financial sanctions.
Yeah.
Krystal.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you go back to the beginning of this, remember the very early days, the thought was the SWIFT banking sanctions were like
whoa.
The end-all be-all of whether you were serious or not about this whole sanction situation. And man, we zoomed right past that. I mean, at the beginning, the idea that the G7 would outright ban Russian oil, even, as it's a little bit unclear exactly when it's going to happen, and it'll be over a timeline and phase and all of that. I mean, I think that would have blown all of our minds at the time.
Oh,
but
yeah, 100%.
bit by bit
I would
by
have been
bit.
like, that's unthinkable.
Yeah, well, there's no way. Like, they can't do that. They're not going to do that. And so we're starting to see what the future looks like, which is, Russia is put in this camp of the official baddie pariah states that the U.S. is going to try to sort of bleed dry and crush economically over a long period of time. And It's hard to know from reporting within the country of just how much these sanctions have hit and how much they've devastated the local population. It's hard to get an accurate picture of that at this point, but there's no doubt if this continues over the long haul, I mean, this will be devastating for regular Russian civilians and for the country. And obviously part of, the overall strategy here, which is not to secure peace, it's to weaken Russia, which frankly is what, if we'd said that at the beginning, people would have said, oh, those are Putin's talking points, you're a conspiracy theorist, et cetera, et cetera. And yet now here we are with, the administration outright admitting it. Boris Johnson reportedly going to Kyiv and saying, hey, we don't want peace. We want you to keep going. Seth Moulton, Democratic congressman, saying, oh, no, actually, we are at war with Russia, so should be thinking of things in that way. All of this happened so quickly and with so little public understanding or discussion that it really is astonishing. And, Ukraine has fallen a little bit out of the news. It's not, the wall-to-wall coverage isn't there anymore, especially with the big news about Roe versus Wade, which we're about to talk about as well. And at the same time, these incredibly momentous and potentially era-defining decisions are being made. And the U.S. public is really not being involved in that.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. We can just tell you. I mean, we can see our data. Ukraine does not perform all that well. Now, we still stacked the first half hour of the show with it because we think it's really important, and we have a subscriber-based model. But, if you're a cable news programmer, you don't want to be covering all of this stuff because you know that it's not going to rate. Luckily, we don't have necessarily the exact same incentive structure, but that's a peek into how exactly these things get made. Your viewership and people's general interest is what drives a lot of the debate and the meta conversation. Part of the point I made in my monologue about the culture wars on Thursday was, just so you know, while we're all squabbling about abortion, the CIA loves that because that is when the gray war actually operates at its highest level, when they have zero public scrutiny. So I did not see nearly enough outcry on the first story that we covered. I didn't see nearly enough analysis on the oil markets.
Yeah.
Also, do we just live in a reality now where gas is $4.50 a gallon? I mean, seriously, months ago, Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Now what? I mean, by the way, it costs a lot of money to fill up your tank. I have not driven past a gas station in 2 months that was less than $4 a gallon. And I think the national average is still $4 something. Just so you know, it was a catastrophe then. It's a catastrophe now. But the conversation on this stuff just continues to fizzle out. G7 is going to ban it. Okay, great. Is anybody going to give us any more gas or something? Because people are really struggling out there. And, that part of the conversation is missing too.
Yeah, that is very well said. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the new developments about how the midterms might shake out as we, now had this leaked draft decision. Looks like Supreme Court set to overturn Roe versus Wade. Dramatic reordering of American politics and upending of a precedent that has been in place for nearly 50 years. So part of what will determine how this goes politically is ultimately how Republicans will respond. And there was a thought that they would just focus on the leak and kind of try not to talk about any of this stuff. And the Republican, Republican Senatorial Committee put out talking points saying, we're not extremists, we're the mainstream ones, the Democrats are the extremists. But we've got already a number of instances where you can see how this decision makes the politics very uncomfortable for Republicans. Now they're getting asked questions about abortion that they really don't want to have to engage with.
Which their base wants and which they do not want to have to engage with.
Exactly. So they either have to extremely piss off their base, extremely piss off their base, or, so they're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. If they try to moderate their positions on abortion to be somewhat in the mainstream of American their base is going to freak out. And if they go along with their base, the rest of the country's like, what the hell? What? That's what you support? That's insane. So one of the first pieces here is Mitch McConnell. Go ahead and throw this tear sheet up on the screen. So he is outright saying that a national federal abortion ban is, in fact, possible. Because some of the talking points we've heard is why don't you just leave it to the states? And if you don't like the regulations in Mississippi, then you can move somewhere else, putting aside how classist that is and how people don't want to move from their homes, et cetera. That is one argument that's been made. And also, if you're in California and you're in New York, that this decision won't affect you that much. Well, now you have Mitch McConnell saying, actually, we're kind of serious about this federal ban. And we had reported last week about how anti-abortion groups, along with some of their closest allies, they've been plotting this for a while now. They've been sort of putting the pieces together, and there's going to be a lot of pressure from the base to basically put up or shut up. All right, now you got your way with Roe versus Wade. This is the next step. You guys said that you're with us. Are you actually going to do it? Let me read to you what McConnell actually said, and then we'll get your reaction, Saagar. So he said, if the leaked opinion became the final opinion, legislative bodies, not only at the state level, but at the federal level, certainly could legislate in that area, and said that a national abortion ban is, quote, worthy of debate. He goes on to say, and if this were the final decision, talking about the leaked draft, that was the point, that it should be resolved one way or another in the legislative process. So yes, it's possible. Those are his words. He also says, with regard to the abortion issue, I think it's pretty clear where Senate Republicans stand, basically saying, yes, we're very pro-life. And if and when the court makes a final decision, I expect everybody will be more definitive, but I don't think it's much secret where Senator Republicans stand on that issue.
So obviously, when he says worthy of debate, that's a very carefully chosen word, because my prediction on this is they're going to hide by the filibuster. Now, because they've already come out and said we're not going to nuke the filibuster in order to have a national ban on abortion. But they may actually find themselves in a very tough position, because per David Shor's analysis, if Trump wins roughly the same amount of vote that he did back in 2020 with maybe, plus 0.2 or 0.3%, you could have a situation where you have a filibuster-proof majority of Republicans in the Senate and Donald Trump in the White House in 2024. Then I just see it. I honestly think a ban really could happen under that, because I don't see how a single one of these people could go back to their base constituents who are overwhelmingly pro-life. I want to emphasize they are, out of step with the rest of the American public, but, that doesn't necessarily matter on some of these things. So it's a serious problem for the Republicans if they may actually, what was the expression you used? Dog that caught the car?
Dog that caught the car.
Yeah, no, it's very true though.
Yeah.
I really do think they're in that situation. And now you're seeing this on the state level. And the reason why I found this clip so significant and we both wanted to play it was because this is going to be the meta-narrative going into the 2022 midterm elections. Now look, who knows how it plays out? I still think the Republicans are, set to win a majority, but it could affect things on the margins. And, our general thesis on culture war issues is that whichever side seems the most extreme on the day of the election, they're the ones who are going to suffer at the ballot box. Personally, I think that's been the Democrats probably for the last 10 years or so. But with the return to abortion politics and the drop of gender ideology, defund the police, and critical race theory, and this to prominence, this puts Republicans on the more extreme side of the issue, and this is a perfect example of a Mississippi governor here being pressed on CNN about an actual abortion ban in that state, which will then come to nationalized politics as many other state bans and state laws have, just like the Florida legislation. So let's take a listen to what that said.
The state of Mississippi will force girls and women who are the victims of incest to carry those childs to term. Can you explain why that is going to be your law?
Well, that's going to be the law because in 2007, the Mississippi legislature passed it. I will tell you, Jake, and this sort of speaks to how far the Democrats in Washington have come on this issue. But in 2007, when the trigger law was put in place, we had a Democrat Speaker of the House, and we had a Democrat Chairman of the Public Health Committee in the Mississippi House of Representatives.
But why are you going to
particular piece of legislation?
Why is it acceptable in your state to force girls who are victims of incest to carry those children to term?
Well, as you know, Jake, over 92% of all abortions in America are elective procedures. When you look at the number of those that actually are involved in incest, it's less than 1%. And if we need to have that conversation in the future about potential exceptions in the trigger law, we can certainly do that. But the reality is that, again, that affects less than 1% of all abortions in America on an annual basis.
Okay, but that is going to be the law of Mississippi. Let me ask you, what about a fetus that has serious or fatal abnormalities that will not allow that fetus to live outside the womb? Is the state of Mississippi going to force those girls and women who have this tragedy inside them to carry the child to term? Are you going to force them to do that?
Well, Jake, I'll tell you, I think that these questions illustrate exactly what we've been talking about, and that is you're dealing in examples that are rare and are a very small percentage of the overall abortions. And the reason for that is because when you talk to Americans, regardless of what the polling says with respect to overturning Roe v. Wade, the vast majority of Americans recognize that the abortion laws in America right now, that is what are extreme.
Yeah, so this is what I'm saying. You know, this is going to be dominating the conversation for months and months to come.
2 weeks ago, he does an interview with Jake Tapper. This does not come up.
Nobody cares. Yeah, we're still talking about Florida.
Now you're
right?
having to defend a law that requires a teenage girl raped by her stepfather to carry that pregnancy to term.
Exactly. And everybody's like, oh, well, that's a fringe exception. It's like, yeah, well, it can still dominate the thing. You know, I was actually thinking back to, when's the last time that the Republican, or this type of culture war was on the national stage? So pre-gay marriage, obviously, Obergefell happened. But Terry Schiavo, do you remember that case?
Yeah.
It was, what was that, 2005? So I was young when it was happening. I've read a little bit about it, but that dominated the national conversation. It was a single person, I forget even which state that this all actually even, I think it was Florida. I think it was Florida. But anyway, that just shows you that those types of cases can dominate the national conversation. So do not, many people, Republicans are saying, oh yeah, it might happen in Mississippi, Alabama. It's not going to affect the team nationally. Well, I mean, we all just saw how Republicans are gaining ground on the Florida legislation, and that's just Florida. Well, now Mississippi, Alabama, various southern states are all going to have to ask this question.
Well, and Mitch McConnell saying, we might do it at the federal level. We might have
to do it, keeping the door open. So the debate, the meta-narrative is shifting against Republicans on this ground. Like I said, I have no idea how this is going to shake out. But all I know is that the more these types of headlines are out there, let's put this up there on the screen, the worse it is going to be for the GOP. People can try and claim that people don't care. And look, maybe people don't care about the overturn of Roe versus Wade, but I'm going to venture to say that the majority of the American population, which is generally pro-choice and, at least up until 15 weeks of pregnancy, when they look at stuff like this, there's a bill, classifying abortion as homicide advanced by Louisiana lawmakers. To be clear, it is not law. To be clear, I don't know if the governor would sign it, all the caveats, etc. Even having this within the realm of debate, just like defund the police was within the realm of debate for the Democrats, is going to dominate the meta conversation around the party and have real tough questions, right? Because, frankly, I think that the pro-life base of the Republican Party is even stronger than the defund the police base of the Democratic Party.
There's zero doubt about that.
So it makes it even harder to go against it whenever you're a GOP politician.
Disorganized.
Well, there you go.
They're not. Listen, Joe Biden is perfectly comfortable. Think about this difference. Joe Biden is perfectly comfortable in response to a call to defund the police to put out an op-ed that's like, screw you, we're going to fund the police.
That's a good point, actually. And
is Mitch McConnell?
No realm of
Mitch McConnell is not able to do that whatsoever. Is Trump going to stand? No, of course not. Of course not. He owes his entire political campaign to this very well-organized part of the base. And by the way, we're going to speak to some of the polling in just a minute. I looked it up. Defund the police, whatever you think about it, is definitely not popular as a slogan. Requiring a woman who's been raped to carry her baby to term is less popular than defund the police.
Wow. Yeah.
So those are the types of, that's how far out you are in terms of the extremist position. And I also think it's really important to understand that when you're talking about the overturn of Roe, you are inherently talking about these early pregnancy bans, because already under Roe, states can ban third trimester abortion. Mm-hmm. They can do whatever they want after the point of viability. So you're only talking about these early stage pregnancies where, yes, if you have an outright ban after 6 weeks, if you have these fetal heartbeat bans, if you have, bans without any sort of exceptions for rape and incest or life and health of the mother or life and health of the baby itself, you are talking about positions that are very much out of step with the mainstream of America. So, listen, again, I always want to restate, I still think overall the midterm landscape is much more favorable to Republicans. There is no question the number one issue on people's minds when they vote, as it typically is going to be the economy. There is no doubt that even though we actually just got a very strong jobs report, inflation is killing people, gas prices are killing people.
Wages are not outpacing inflation.
That's exactly right.
Story. Yeah,
people are getting a pay cut every single week, every single month, every single year because of inflation outpacing any sort of wage gains. That will be the primary issue that defines this election, not to mention, the historic trends of party in power typically does poorly because their base is kind of apathetic. The opposition is much more motivated. I don't think any of this changes that overall picture, but does it make things a lot more difficult for Republicans on the margins? Yes. Are you going to have specific examples where some Republican candidate goes out and pulls like a Todd Aiken, opining about legitimate rape or whatever it is that falls out of the... Yeah, you could have those sorts of situations too that puts seats out of play for Republicans that otherwise would have been in.
Well, that's just like Democrat. You'll find some fringe Democrat politician who's like, we're going to defund the police, like we're going to, whatever, remake society, whatever, cultural Marxism. That always gets a huge amount of play in the right and, on social media. Well, now you have a flip of the dynamic. So I would just, look, we see how it works against the left. Now you can also see how it works against the right.
And it is a much more organized and more established strain in the Republican base. Because as Mitch McConnell said, like every single senator is pro-life.
Yeah, on the record.
Now, do they, let me take that back. Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski claim to be pro-choice.
Right, they're pro-Roe, right? I never know how to parse these politics.
Yes, exactly. I mean, they try to kind of play both sides, but they, would they go along with complete bans and no exceptions for rape and incest and those sorts of, I don't think they would be on board with that. But the overwhelming majority of the Republican caucus is on board with things like this, would support a federal ban on abortion. So defund, again, whatever you think about it, and I personally do think that police departments, clearly we've been funding them and militarizing them and it has not helped in terms of crime, but whatever you think of the policy, there are very few representatives in Congress and none in the Senate who have embraced this rhetoric. It is coming, directly from the activist base. So this is a much more widespread sentiment that is very much out of step with where the American people broadly are on the issues.
I think that's right. Okay, let's actually parse some of that politics. Let's put this up there on the screen. CNN did an immediate reaction poll to all of this. And I think, it's important to state that whenever it's not actually the law of the land and you try and explain this to somebody who doesn't even know that much, like, well, what's a leak? What do you mean? What is a leak decision? Is it the law or not? It does get complicated. But, to show you the other side, the Supreme Court decision has not really shaken up the midterm landscape. 66% said Roe versus Wade should not be struck down. 59% said they would support Congress passing legislation to establish a nationwide right to abortion, including 81% of Democrats, 65% of independents, and 30% of Republicans. But comparing the results of a new poll to one conducted immediately before the revelation, the impact appears fairly muted. So the share of registered voters who say they are extremely or enthusiastic about voting this fall rose 6 points between the first survey and the second, but that increase is even across party lines. Even amongst Democrats, who they say are extremely or very enthusiastic, is up 7 points, but among Republicans, it's 56%, up 9 points. Voters who say that overturning Roe would make them happy are nearly twice as enthusiastic about voting this fall as those who say such a ruling would leave them angry. Only 38% extremely enthusiastic about those happy, 20% amongst those who are angry. And the share of Americans who would be angry in the wake of such a ruling is 36%, which of course outweighs the 17% who would be happy. But again, when you have, basically a double-digit enthusiasm gap, that is going to be the biggest thing. And the final thing I will say before I get your reaction, Krystal, is that abortion is just not the only factor for most voters.
Yeah.
Republicans hold a narrow edge on the generic ballot, 49 to 42, which is immense. 7 point, which remember the Krystal and Saagar rule, add like 3 points.
Right.
10 points is more likely to see what it is whenever it's the GOP. And whenever you look at it, inflation is the number one concern amongst voters. Another Gallup thing came out. We'll be talking to Mohamed Younis from Gallup. I'm sure we'll talk about this with him. Gallup, which came out this morning, we're like, hey, for the last year, single theme, we're getting hammered. Grocery store, gas, It's killing us at home. So look, this could be the one area where a material politics can trump everything, just because inflation is so out of hand for most people's pocketbook.
I think that the big question and why it makes it complicated to understand how this may all play out politically is because midterm elections are so much about base turnout. So you already had Republicans, like the people who are going to be super psyched that Roe was overturned, those people were already psyched up to vote for Republicans this fall. So the difference is, is this for young voters who were disgusted with the Biden administration, his approval rating has fallen off a cliff with them. Are they going to now be motivated to come out and vote for Democrats because of this decision? I don't know the answer to that. I think that's really an open question. I think the Democrats have a weak case to make of basically like, reelect us and we promise this time will be different and we'll actually do something about it. However, when you've got Mitch McConnell out there basically saying, yeah, we might do the federal ban, well, then the Democrats don't actually have to do anything because you can just say, well, listen, we may not be ready to codify Roe into law and provide you with the protection you actually want, but what they're doing is way worse. So once again, it gives the Democrats the ability to do nothing and just say, but we're a little better than the Republicans and, it's existential, so you have to come out and vote for us. Will it work? I don't know. I do think that if you were going to, probably the place where this may make things more difficult for Republicans and have the biggest impact is like in some of the suburban areas where they were hoping with Trump not on the ballot and where, parents have been frustrated with Democratic policies on schools, but also on, inflation and gas pumps and all that stuff. Maybe this helps to allow Democrats to shore up some of the voters that they had won in previous elections. Maybe that's the place where there's the biggest impact. It's really hard to say. It was really interesting. There was a comprehensive study of all of the abortion polling since Roe versus Wade was ultimately passed. Let's go ahead and throw this tear sheet up on the screen. This is from AEI, and it was pretty interesting digging into this, Saagar. They say Attitudes About Abortion, a comprehensive review of polls from the 1970s to today. One of the things that stands out the most is that people's sentiment hasn't changed much. It's remarkably steady on this issue.
Yeah. There was one weird pro-life increase in 2008. And since then, it's basically the exact same thing.
Overall, attitudes have basically existed within the same band, within the same margin for almost 50 years. There has been a little bit of an increase in the number of people who say that abortion should be legal in all circumstances, and a little bit of a decrease in the number of people who say it should be illegal in all circumstances. But overall, you continue to have a dynamic where, those two positions, the sort of, the most extreme positions are supported by the fewest numbers, and the bulk of people either say it should be legal in most but not all circumstances, or it should be illegal in most but all circumstances. And the other thing that really comes out is that the American people are able to hold two thoughts in their mind about abortion at the same time. Here's what they said in this. They say Americans appear to be simultaneously pro-life and pro-choice. Significant numbers of people say abortion is an act of murder, but they also say that the decision to have an abortion should be a personal choice. These are contradictory sentiments, yet many people hold them at the same time, and many see no reason to resolve the tensions in these positions. They believe in the sanctity of life, and they also believe in the importance of individual choice. I personally don't think that's crazy. I mean, you have two competing moral claims here.
Right.
And so most Americans are able to look at that and say, okay, well, there are some circumstances where, I'm really not comfortable when you talk very late in the pregnancy. That's a very different deal than very early on, and I feel very differently about it. I don't think that's a crazy thing whatsoever. And so when you take in the fact that people hold both of these thoughts in their mind, that's why when you end up being the party that's on the extreme side of this debate, you are not going to have the American public broadly with you. And even within the Republican Party, there's a significant chunk that is not going to be comfortable with always illegal in all circumstances from the day of conception and, from the moment you have a fetal heartbeat. There's a significant chunk of even the Republicans who are not comfortable with that.
Look, social libertarianism is baked into the Americans' blood, live and let live. So many people can say, well, I personally would not, go through with that. But, especially in an increasingly secular country, I mean, look, the country was dramatically more Christian in the 1970s whenever this happened, and people still, when they were literally church-going Christians, still said, yeah, I think it should probably be legal up until the first trimester. I mean, compare that to today. I'm not talking about atheism. I'm talking about like general secularization, decline in church-going membership, and all across the board in the way that people believe, agnosticism being dramatically increased, and even among self-identified Christians, the way that they actually believe in God is dramatically dropped over the last 20 to 30 years, especially in the last decade. Well, in that country, and especially amongst the Republicans, I've been, beating this probably to like a dead horse, but the new culture war is not theocratic, really, in nature at all. And that's part of the problem, which is that this returns us to the 1990s types of debates, where actually a lot of the political correctness movement was on the left back in the 90s against the moral majority of the right.
Yeah.
So it really is scrambling the way that a lot of things are. It's kind of a return to like almost a South Park era, like during the George W. Bush administration, in terms of making fun of and going after theocratic Christians. That really is the change. Where it's like a flash in the pan moment that reminds us that these wars are not 100% settled. I think it's pretty interesting, in terms of that survey of the data, that even in a very, very much more Christian nation at the time, sentiment really has not changed all that much.
Yeah, it really is interesting. It's another one where there's a little bit of generational differences, but not much, which is also very unusual in terms of our politics.
Right.
Most of the issues that we talk about in debate here, younger generations tend to be much more liberal, much more progressive. Here, there isn't quite that divide, which I guess makes sense when you talk about older generations having personal firsthand experience with what this actually looked like and the sort of visceral fights of that time. But overall, looking at the polling, I think you'd be hard-pressed to make the case that this totally, changes the game for Democrats. But do you now have Republicans on the defensive, having to try to spin like, Governor Tate Reeves of Mississippi did that we were just talking about, and say, well, yeah, that sounds really terrible, making a woman carry pregnancy to term who was raped, but it doesn't happen all that often. That's just not a strong leg to stand on. It's not a strong leg for Democrats to stand on when they say, partial birth abortion, you might not like it, it might feel like really terrible to you, but it doesn't happen that often. If you believe that something is morally wrong, it's morally wrong whether it happens in one instance or 1,000 or 100,000 instances. So point. I don't think that that's a particularly compelling dodge here, ultimately, that it doesn't happen that often. And your point about all it takes is one horrific, morally outrageous instance where you put a face and a name and you really viscerally understand this to actually completely upend the national debate and have a significant impact on our politics.
It's happened before. It can happen again.
Indeed.
All right, let's move on. This is really interesting in terms of a leaked pitch deck from Elon Musk, who's wooing investors in order to join him in his takeover of Twitter. Let's put this up there on the screen. The Daily Mail did the best job, I think, in a headline of kind of aggregating the top line. That's what they're really good at.
Yeah.
So they don't break the news, but they always do the best headlines. Here's what it is. Elon Musk plans to fire 1,000 Twitter staff, quintuple revenue, get 69 million users to pay $3 a month, and to cut reliance on advertising income in terms of his presentation to investors. So the plan to quintuple Twitter revenue is the main top line here for the investors. They want to increase revenue to $26.4 billion by 2028. Now, keep that in mind. Twitter made $5 billion just last year, and they didn't even make that much in profit. Some of the things I've been trying to emphasize for a while is Twitter is actually not a very good business from a technology point of view. They do not print money in the way that Google and Facebook have. They're much smaller in terms of their market cap. They're much smaller in terms of their overall revenue. Their overall business model is really not that good. They have a great product, which elites love, but they've never found a way in order to monetize that effectively. What Elon is saying is that for people who have significant platforms, I guess we would qualify for that. I don't know. Let's talk after this. Would we pay actually in order to increase that? So what he's saying is that people who have large platforms which rely on Twitter in order to talk to their followers would have to pay for that privilege. it actually makes quite a bit of sense to me. I mean, if you think about whenever we have major announcements or things that we want to direct Elite way, or just in general to have links everywhere, we use Twitter. I use Twitter in order to gauge sometimes in the general discourse of national politics. Would I pay $3 a month for that? What do you think, Krystal?
Yes,
I think I probably would too.
I mean, the problem is, here's the concern. I mean, there's a couple things here. First of all, there was some thought going into this of, he doesn't really care about the money.
Yeah.
He cares about the values.
Well, now he cares about the money because Tesla stock has gone down.
Doesn't seem to be the case.
I will defend it a little bit. In the decline in the public markets and when you're borrowing billions of dollars based upon the value of your stock, is like, well, now you need to care about the money because you don't have as much money.
But the minute that listen, he's still like the richest man on the planet, so he's doing okay. But the minute that you move from, all right, we're just going to focus on these values to, all right, we got to like quintuple revenue in a couple years here, you're going to have some moral and ethical dilemmas and issues that you have to deal with. Now, in general, I wish that the entire social media ecosystem had been much more dependent on subscriber fees. I mean, I wish they were public utilities and that they were effectively nationalized, but that's another debate for another day. But I think it would be a much better ecosystem if it was less dependent on advertiser revenue, because that's how you end up with the sort of like hellscape of algorithmic, agitation and fear-mongering and outrage and division. And that's how you end up in that place. And that's also how you end up with, people who are susceptible to this having this sort of like issues with addictive behavior, because ultimately, if you are an advertiser, what do you want? You want people to be on there looking at your ads for as much time as you possibly can, whether or not that is a good experience for them. So bottom line is, you haven't been the customer for these platforms. The advertisers have been, and that creates a very different dynamic. So I don't have a problem with the idea of moving more towards, all right, if you're like a super user like us and you can afford $3 a month, no problem that you're going to need to pay for that privilege. I don't have a problem with that. The issue that I have is that and The Verge actually wrote this up. He also in this pitch deck says that he expects Twitter to earn some portion of its revenue through data licensing, a business that involves selling the millions of daily tweets on its platform to companies and developers that then analyze that data for market insights or consumer trends. So right now, under the current terms of service, you own your tweets. This seems to raise the question of whether that might change and whether it might be Twitter that owns your tweets and is then able to do what Facebook and so many of these other companies do and package up your data and sell it off so that you can be pitched to by
I didn't even catch that.
Advertising companies. Yeah. So they say last year Twitter earned $572 million in data licensing and quote other revenue. Unclear on how or if Musk plans on expanding this business. If they were to resell individual tweets, Elon would, quote, have to radically change the terms of service, not to mention face, quote, huge rev share and fair use issues as the copyright of tweets belong to the users who posted them. So that's one part that is potentially troubling here. I don't have an issue with moving away from the advertiser-backed model to more of a subscription model. I mean, it echoes part of what we do.
I'm a huge believer in subscription.
It's what we do here, as long as you're making it available and accessible to all people so that it doesn't become, a class issue and people can't afford to pay, don't have access to.
Yeah, I think they should charge people like us. We need it for our jobs.
Yeah, so I don't have an issue with that. This is the big question mark of what exactly they're thinking of doing here.
And per the presentation, they plan currently, Twitter relies on 90% of its revenue from advertising. He wants to reduce that down to 45%, which actually is perfect, really, in terms of balance. And in terms of the overall, cyclical business within the ad model, people should remember advertising, peaks during certain seasons. You make the bulk of your revenue at a certain time. It's a totally crazy business for anybody who's involved in this. And the most reliant and best thing in the world is just consistent revenue that comes in on the basis. We can speak from personal experience. That's how you pay your bills, and you make sure that this stuff actually all gets paid on time. I do want to, emphasize though that some of the partners that he's bringing in here are some unsavory characters and very contradictory to some of the original stuff, which I'll talk more about in my monologue. Let's get this up there on the screen. Take a look here at some of the nearly $7 billion that he's currently filed in terms of commitments that he's gotten. So That includes major billionaires like Larry Ellison, Binance, and Sequoia. I'm generally fine with institutional capital, but one on here bothers me a little bit, Krystal. $375 million from the Qatar Holding LLC, aka the Qatari royal family, and
cool.
the Qatari royal family, as well as, if you guys will remember, the Saudi prince who he was tasseling with originally. Well, that guy has now agreed to convert his Twitter holding into stock in the company. So he will now be a nearly $2 billion holder of the same Twitter under Elon Musk. So Musk does not have to buy him out. So Elon now faces the same Saudi problem that Twitter had in the first place. Now, I guess, I mean, it's better on balance you have a guy who called him out in public, but like, is it still good when the Saudis control $2 billion worth of the company? Now, for the inevitable comments, I know that the Kingdom Holding Company is not part of the actual kingdom itself, but given that all the Saudi princes there are under the rule of MBS, and that guy literally got his ass thrown in prison by MBS, you tell me who runs the show in Saudi Arabia. So I would say now we have two Gulf kingdoms, not one, that have their dirty little hands
diversified.
in their, he's diversified. He's got their hands in the company. It wasn't a racial comment, by the way. It's about their general way that they approach politics and how they buy lobbying influence here in Washington. I used to live in Qatar. Let's just say it's not a very nice country.
Yeah.
And the royal family over there is famous for these types of antics. Yeah.
Well, I did do a little bit of research so that I had some specifics about their free speech position. They have a slew of laws about this, but there's a brand new one that they just passed recently that says biased broadcasting or publishing can be punished by up to 5 years in prison. Back in 2012, a Qatari poet was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for reciting a poem critical of the emir in his private apartment while living abroad.
Awesome.
He served 4 years in prison before being released on pardon. I also wanted to mention, the billionaire on there, Larry Ellison, just in terms of his views. At one point, at least, he was critical of Edward Snowden, saying that Snowden had yet to identify a single person who'd been wrongly injured by the NSA's data collection.
Because Oracle does a bunch of business with the NSA. That completely makes sense.
Yeah,
To give people some insight, I lived in Qatar. I went to high school there. I graduated from high school there. We were all terrified. We were made it known to us, even as Americans, that if we talked badly about the royal family, and I went to the American school, so they were actually members of the royal family.
Oh, wow.
I actually will never forget this. Our principal had to clear the graduation date with the guy who was graduating. He's like, hey, are you good with this? He's like, can we graduate on this day so that the princes and all these people could come?
That's a whole different deal right there.
Let me tell you something. I've never appreciated the First Amendment and all that more until I set back foot on American soil. And I was like, thank God I'm out of this hellhole, because living under an actual Islamic theocracy, I don't think people can really appreciate what it's like to say, hey, and you're seeing all these unjust things happening around you. I was in a unique position because, obviously I'm of Indian origin, and there are all these basically Indian slaves who live in Qatar and get their passports confiscated. And Qatar has all these fake, well, look, this was 2008, so it's been a while. I don't know if it's still on the books, but at the time they had all these complicated rules to bar basically those people from public spaces. And they would come up to me and they'd be like, hey, what are you doing here? And I was like, what? And they're like, oh, you're American. They're like, you're good. So they would let you into a public space, but they would keep people who look just like me, but happen to be from India, elsewhere. And a lot of these guys, part of the reason my parents left is because these guys would come to my parents and beg them for money and ask them for help because because my parents at least speak the same language as them. And they were like, they're living under legit indentured servitude. They have no freedom whatsoever. And anyway, look, I'm telling you, these are not good people. You don't want any business to do with them whatsoever. No matter how fancy the Al Thani family, who are the ruling family, come to Washington, they wear their Burberry scarves, and we're just like you. It's like, no, we're not. I know how you make your money, and I know how you treat people, specifically women, back home when nobody is looking. So keep that in mind about how these people really live behind closed doors. They sip martinis in D.C., but not over there.
So some trouble in Camelot here, I think, fair to say, in terms of, I mean, this guy has his own interests, Elon Musk. And the idea that he's going to be the savior of free speech, I think we should all temper our expectations here, bottom line.
Absolutely.
Speaking of free speech, we have a new White House press secretary. Let's go ahead and throw the announcement up on the screen. We knew for a while that Jen Psaki was stepping down. Now we have a date. She is going to depart from the White House on May 13th. President Biden has announced Karine Jean-Pierre as she will be promoted to assistant to the president and White House press secretary. I actually knew her a little bit back at MSNBC. We were there, we overlapped at the same time. She had come from Move On, which, you know, previously had been sort of like the left flank of the Democratic Party pre-Bernie and all of that. Move On was, I mean, they got their start during the Iraq War. That was actually part of my first
Move On was Lewinsky scandal. That's what the whole thing was. Then it became more prominent.
Right, during the Iraq War.
They had like their second rebirth during Iraq, and then they had their third rebirth becoming a cringe like identity politics.
Resistance lib. Yeah,
it's actually really sad.
Landed. It is sad. I mean, it says there's a lot you could say about that particular arc. We'll save that for another day. She also, I mean, she's been, they say, a longtime advisor to Biden, served in senior communication political roles in the Biden administration, Biden campaign, and then Vice President Biden in the Obama administration. So kind of long time in the firmament of D.C. Democratic operative. She was someone who had been floated for this position. No big surprise, ultimately, that she got it. Let's go ahead and throw this next piece up on the screen. This is being celebrated as a huge history-making moment, first Black person. So I actually didn't occur to me that there had never been a Black person in this role before. So not just first Black woman, but first Black person. And first openly gay woman to become White House press secretary. So, you know, we're not getting student loan debt relief, we're not getting health care, but you are getting a queer Black woman to be paid to lie to you. So I guess that's what we're gonna count as progress. That's not particular to her, that's just literally what the job entails, essentially.
Look, this is always the case with these diversity things. It's like when the NASDAQ said that you can't go public, or maybe it was the Dow Jones, like you have to have a Black person on your board. It's like, oh great, you know, now a Black person on the board of the company that will pay, screw its workers.
Right, or like the CIA diversity. Wow. I mean, it's not quite as bad, I think, as the CIA diversity ads.
I think Jimmy Dore once said something. He's like, Gina Haspel broke a glass ceiling so she could use the glass to cut somebody's throat.
Slay queen, I guess. I don't know.
I'll never forget what he said.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's perfect. It's perfect neoliberal brain to substitute, you know, sort of representation win as real progress for the masses. But anyway, we'll see. I've nothing personally against Karine Jean-Pierre in terms of, you know, when I knew her at MSNBC or anything like that.
I don't know anything about her.
Yeah.
I've never had any personal experience. My general reaction, like, is the cringe identity politics one, which is like, everyone's like, oh, the first one. I'm like, okay, why don't we go through a comprehensive list of lies that she's already told on public and then go through that and match that with her record? That seems like a great act of journalism. I would support that for Sarah Sanders, Kayleigh McEnany, any press secretary who is out there. That is something that actual journalism should do. And also, you know, Howie Kurtz over at Fox News had a sit down with Jen Psaki and pressed her about the ethics concerns. Not a very good job, but we'll play it for you. Nonetheless, it's important to remember this. No press secretary, to my knowledge in history, has negotiated a contract with a private news organization while remaining the press secretary. You and I knew. Everybody knew this lady was going to MSNBC. Everyone. All of her former colleagues did. Josh Earnest, Ben Rhodes, all those people from the Obama administration. They at least had the dignity to leave first. You can't leave and then go over to 30 Rock and negotiate your contract. You should not be openly negotiating contracts while you're sitting press secretary. And she assures us, I consider myself a very ethical person. Let's take a listen.
I know you can't discuss your next job for ethical reasons, but it's been widely reported. You got a lot of criticism over possible conflicts during this period. Did that bother you?
Of course, because I'm a human being. But what I know is what I try to do every day. And I hold myself to a very high ethical standard. I took steps and have taken steps as I've had any discussions with any future employer that go over and above any requirements by government, recusing myself of any discussions as well. And I'm proud of that. And I think and hope, and this is very public in a job like mine, people judge me by how I engage and interact with reporters. And I think it's been clear I've treated everybody the same from the beginning, and that's been a point of pride for me.
Okay. What? Like, what does that even, I don't care about how you consider yourself. Everybody considers themselves an ethical person. Nixon considered himself an ethical person. Okay. I mean, here's the point.
George W. Bush.
Yeah, George W. Bush.
An ethical person.
Considers himself myself a devout evangelical Christian who has done no wrong in this world, okay? I mean, I can tell you that based upon people I know who've spoken to him, specifically about the Iraq war. Does that mean that we don't get to say, maybe you consider yourself? There's a reason that we don't leave ethical declarations up to the people who are supposed to declare themselves ethical. I think that's really the crux of this whole situation.
Especially in government. Like,
yeah.
You're just going to be like, I trust, they say they're doing the right thing. That's good enough for me.
Okay.
Come on.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, he asked the wrong question here of, did that basically, like, how did you feel about it?
Yeah, what a chicken shit way to ask
Yeah,
that.
it's like, I don't care how she felt about it. I care whether there were ethical violations here. I care what you actually did. How did those conversations unfold? She's allowed to be very vague about, trust me, I did the right thing. And, you can see that I treated all people the same. Also, given that he's at Fox News, I think it'd be perfectly reasonable to say, listen, there was a lot of criticism, and justifiably, about the revolving door between Fox News and the Trump administration. But, seems to be not the same level of concern here when it comes to Jen Psaki, although, this was just to give you a sense of how sort of outrageous and egregious this was. Even mainstream reporters, even her future colleagues at NBC, I remember Kristen Welker asking very pointed questions about how this was okay and how this was ethically acceptable. And we still don't have any real answers to that.
It's I just can't understand. Why don't you just leave and then make the call, Why is that so difficult? Like,
It's
are
really
you
not.
are you so hard up for cash? Which, by the way, is not true. I know that she's already made well over $1 million in the private sector.
Well, she was
before
working
this.
for that union busting
That's what I'm saying.
GSG
Yeah. So she's cashed plenty of corporate
consulting
checks.
firm that was,
Right.
working with Amazon to help bust the unions.
So
up
I'm like,
there.
you literally can't go a day without a paycheck, even though you made like millions of. Now, look, I'm not going to judge your personal financial situation, but like, I'm just telling you, like, as a public official, you have now comported yourself in a very significant problem. So, as you said, even the NBC colleagues were like, this is kind of messed up in terms of what you're doing, and I think it's incredibly outrageous.
Yeah, because it put them in an awkward position.
It should.
They
Yeah.
didn't.
They look
didn't
terrible.
like the appearance of that.
Right. Okay, let's move on. This is a very important confrontation that happened on Capitol Hill. Senator Rand Paul pressing DHS Secretary Mayorkas about the Disinformation Governance Board. And I think that Rand Paul said something that we've been trying to emphasize here, which is that the U.S. government cannot and should not be able to sort out what is disinformation because it has been one of the greatest purveyors of disinformation in the history of the world. Let's watch that confrontation.
Do we have policies? Do we have guardrails? Do we have standards?
But here's the problem.
ensure-
We
if I
can't
may,
even
this is
agree. We can't even
extremely-
agree what disinformation is.
This is-
You
well-
can't even agree that it was disinformation, that the Russians fed information to the Steele dossier. If you can't agree to that, how are we ever going to come to an agreement on what is disinformation so you can police it on social media? I think you've got no idea what disinformation is, and I don't think the government's capable of it. Do you know who the greatest propagator of disinformation in the history of the world is? The U.S. government. Are you familiar with McNamara, the Pentagon Papers? Are you familiar with George W. Bush and the weapons of mass destruction? Are you familiar with Iran-Contra? I mean, think of all the debates and disputes we've had over the last 50 years in our country. We work them out by debating them. We don't work them out by the government being the arbiter. I don't want guardrails. I want you to have nothing to do with speech. You think we can't determine, speech by traffickers is disinformation? You think the American people are so stupid they need you to tell them what the truth is? You can't even admit what the truth is with the Steele dossier. I don't trust government to figure out what the truth is. Government is largely disseminating disinformation.
He's right. Look, no matter who you are, Mayorkas, Trump, Obama, Bill Clinton, all the way back, FDR, even the best presidents, they have sowed disinformation. It is the job of the press and of a free society in order to expose that disinformation and for all of us in order to consider the ups and the downs and the plus and the minus. So we should not have any entity out there which is government affiliated, issuing guidance on this. I mean, I'll even go so far as to say on the Russians, I don't think it is up to America to say that the Russians are sowing, they can say, look, we disagree, with this. I think it should be up to us. They can issue, guidance or whatever, but they should not be out there declaring and classifying things and then feeding that to the tech companies, Krystal. And that is what this new board, by all accounts, appears to be doing. They say we're going to stick only to foreign disinformation. But as Rand Paul, you think we need the DHS to tell us that people, the drug smugglers are feeding Hondurans?
lying to people.
Oh no! Oh wow! What a novel concept.
There were a couple things I really appreciated about that whole speech. And I have a healthy bit of skepticism about Rand Paul. So when I saw this going viral, it was not a sure thing for me that I was going to like what he had to say. But there were two things I really appreciated. Number one was that he used examples that were from Republican administrations. For a Republican to directly call out the George W. Bush administration,
It's like
weapons of
him
mass
and
destruction.
Trump.
That is a very new phenomenon, and it is not certainly across the board. We saw in the Ketanji Brown Jackson confirmation hearings how they were still using this, trying to defend torture and trying to use against her the fact that she had been on the side of standing up for the Constitution against indefinite detention and those things against her. So those politics are not dead. There are still a lot of people in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party, by the way, who still are totally in neocon brain land. So I appreciated that. Pointed to Iran-Contra, of course, that's under the Reagan administration. So that made the point really honest and salient because he wasn't just cherry picking the Democratic abuses, of which there are many, right?
Yes.
So I appreciated that. The other part I really appreciated was something that we've talked about on this show here before, is he made this comment do you really think that the American people are so stupid that they can't figure out that smugglers are lying and trafficking in disinformation? And that's, to me, really the crux of this whole issue, is that you have a large and growing sentiment of elected officials and also just, frankly, regular Americans who don't believe that their fellow citizens are really up to participating as citizens in a democracy, that they can't handle it. That concern has been present since the founding of the Republic.
Literally.
And that when you have that sentiment of I can't trust these people out here to be, in the messy give and take of a democracy and figure things out for themselves with the help of a free press and with all of the, wealth of information that exists out there in our ecosystem now, when you get to that point, then what does that justify? That justifies you can't handle it. First of all, we're going to censor you. We're not going to allow you to see certain things. We're not going to allow you to say certain things. It leads to police state authoritarianism atmosphere. And it also leads to the flip side of that is, so we have to hand total control to the experts. It's just this group of educated, credentialed elites. They're the only ones we can really trust with this governance and democracy stuff. Democracy is not for the people. And so I really appreciate that his point gets at that piece, because I really think that's that's why this debate is so incredibly important.
100%. And let's just be reminded of who the new head of this board is, the so-called
Found the most
disinformation
cringe person in the entire country.
No, literally, yeah. Like I said, look, theater kid who, unlike me, was not mugged by reality. The worst of all worlds. Here's where she gave a recent interview. Let's take a listen.
There's already this idea, this allegation that there is anti-conservative bias on the platforms, even though there has been study after study proving, in fact, that often it's liberal voices that are being silenced, particularly minority voices on social media.
Where do these fake studies come from? Do I doubt that there are, actually, liberal is not the right word. Are there left accounts which are censored? Yeah,
yes.
All of the time. And we have pointed to many of those instances, specifically who are anti-imperialist or anti-war activists are the most likely. Some of them may be people of color. Are liberal voices, BLM activists getting silenced on Twitter? Get out of here, okay? That is the most ludicrous accusation. And they always come up with this fake data and these experts in order to just justify a censorious, elite liberal point of view. I wish they would just say that. They're like, listen, we think some voices are abhorrent, we think others aren't, and not rely on all of this fakery. But look, this deserves serious scrutiny. This lady is now the head of a U.S. government agency with possible power over social media companies, over very least guidance, whatever that means, from the Department of Homeland Security, which is the largest law enforcement agency in the entire United States. A lot of people forget that. They have immense power over our lives.
Yeah, I thought about her comment there a lot, actually. First of all, I think it's a little revealing that she just conflates liberals and people of color as if there's no ideological diversity. I'm sure that there are a lot of people of color who are being censored who have dissident views.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. The reason why you don't see liberal voices being censored like you do, voices who are outside of the mainstream is because, these companies are run by billionaires and, they are culturally, they tend to have, a very specific sort of ideology that conforms with what, the liberal media and wants to put out there. If you're basically in line with the cultural views of the powers that be, then you're not going to be censored. You're not ultimately going to have an issue. To me, it doesn't really matter which part of the spectrum is being censored more or less, because this is a value. It's about the values. It's about the principles. It's about being committed to living in a democracy and what that ultimately entails. So, yes.
Absolutely right. Krystal, what are you taking a look at?
Quite an epic week just unfolded for workers, capped off by some utter betrayal from the White House. Allow me to explain. So on Thursday last week, Amazon Labor Union President Christian Smalls testified in front of the Senate Budget Committee on Amazon at Bernie Sanders' request. It was actually pretty extraordinary. Chris was not having it with Senator Lindsey Graham's anti-union talking points, and he had a message for all politicians.
It's not a Democrat or a Republican thing. It's a workers' thing. It's a workers' issue. And we're the ones that are suffering in the corporations that you're talking about, in the businesses that you're talking about, in the warehouses that you're talking about. So that's the reason why I think I was invited today to speak on that behalf. And you should listen, because we do represent your constituents as well. So just take that into consideration, that the people are the ones that make these corporations go. It's not the other way around.
Next, it was off to the White House for a photo op with other workers and organizers from Starbucks and other locations. Here are some of the photos of Chris in his Eat the Rich jacket, meeting with Biden, Kamala, and Labor Secretary Marty Walsh. Biden apparently told Chris that he had gotten him into trouble. Presumably, Biden was referring to a moment from a few weeks back when he said in a speech, "Amazon, here we come." Of course, mere hours later, his press secretary was at the podium to walk those mild comments back. And so it was for the worker photo op. Nice show of support, genuinely positive, symbolic step forward as compared to the anti-union or union-indifferent presidents we've had my entire life. But mere hours later, we learned that while Biden might be willing to pose with workers at the White House, he had already sold them out. Our partners at The Lever have that report. Quote, Amazon gets huge contract. Despite Biden's union pledge, the president promised to halt federal contracts to union busters, but the deal was just re-awarded to Amazon while the company was crushing a union drive. So a massive $10 billion cloud computing contract for the NSA was recently ratified by the Biden administration, a clear violation of Biden's pledge to deny federal contracts to union busters and to be the most pro-union president in history. And there is no denying that Amazon violates labor law to bust unions routinely. Their actions were so egregious in Bessemer that the National Labor Relations Board actually forced an election do-over. And Biden's own NLRB prosecutors just found that Amazon broke the law with illegal captive audience union busting meetings during the Staten Island union drive. The NLRB also found that Amazon illegally fired union supporter Daquan Smith. Smith has been so hard hit by the job loss that he was forced into homelessness and now resides in a Queens shelter. So it's not like ambiguous or a matter of opinion that Amazon routinely violates the law in order to bust unions. They have repeatedly and consistently been found to do so by official government bodies. Nor was Biden's pledge ambiguous at all. In fact, Bernie Sanders just sent him a letter calling on him to uphold this pledge, writing in part, "As you will recall, during the presidential campaign, you promised to institute a multi-year federal debarment for all employers who illegally oppose unions and to ensure federal contracts only go to employers who sign neutrality agreements committing not to run anti-union campaigns." That campaign promise was exactly right. Today, I am asking you to fulfill that promise. Now, Biden doesn't need Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema or the Republicans or the parliamentarian or filibuster reform to fulfill this promise. He can do it all on his own. And right now is an absolutely crucial time for Amazon labor union because winning the election, that was just the first step. Now they've got to get a contract. And Amazon has already signaled they are going to do everything in their power to keep that from happening. They are bound and determined to snuff this budding union movement out. And the best way for them to do that is to screw over these workers and show to the rest of their workforce and to the nation at large that winning a union did not deliver material benefits. The law requires Amazon to negotiate a contract in good faith, but corporations use every trick in the book to give some appearance of good faith negotiations when really their only goal is to drag things out and maintain the status quo. That's why 1 year after union elections, the majority of organized units still have not won a contract. And according to the Economic Policy Institute, 2 years after union elections, 37% of organized units still have no contract. Now, workers can use militant tools like the threat of strikes to try to force employers to play ball. And Amazon definitely does need this massive Staten Island warehouse in order to service the NYC metro area. But what workers really need is a government that's going to back them up. Instead, they're getting weak shit like this from Biden's labor secretary, Marty Walsh.
The vice president were there, I think, speaking with them at the White House. I think the president popped in, too, according to Chris Smalls. He tweeted about it. He, of course, as you know, is the guy who kind of led that whole union effort at the Staten Island Amazon warehouse. Secretary Walsh, Amazon has been a recipient of some big federal contracts, as you know, something senators like Bernie Sanders, some labor leaders have said should end. For a White House that says they back unions and are pro-unions, should you be awarding federal money to a company that is perceived as anti-union in this moment?
I don't think we need to go there right now. What I think we need to do right now is encourage Amazon and Starbucks and other big companies in America that workers have taken a vote to organize and ask them to come to the table and sit down and work out an agreement with them. These are workers that work in an Amazon warehouse. These are workers that are working in Starbucks and some other industries that were in my office today. Quite honestly, their employees have decided that they want to join a union, and they should respect the right of their employees. And what they should do right now, instead of trying to break the union, is sit down with these workers and try and come up with an agreement to move forward. And I would encourage all these companies to do that because we're not at the point right now, I don't think, where we need to take any other action. It's really encouraging both sides to sit down.
So they're not going to actually keep their promises or use the power at their disposal. They're just going to do a worker photo op and rhetorically encourage Amazon to sit down. I'm sure that's going to work out. I'm sure the power-hungry, greedy ghouls at Amazon will hear Marty Walsh's encouragement and decide to do the right thing, putting aside their lust for higher profit margins and dictator-level coercion to deliver a fair contract for their new union workers. This is far from over, though, friends. Amazon is bidding on another multi-billion-dollar federal government contract, so there is still an opportunity for Biden to actually live up to his words and deliver for the workers that he is happy to pat on the back. The pressure slogan writes itself: no union contract, no government contract. And right now is an absolutely critical time. As the economy heads towards possible recession, we're finding out whether the new union energy is a sustaining trend, a true rebalancing of the scales towards workers, or more of a flash in the pan. Few things will be as critical to writing that story as what happens with the brave workers who unionized at Amazon. Chris Smalls has said that he's now heard from every Amazon warehouse in the entire country about potential unionizing. A potential revolutionary groundswell is knocking at the door. And if Biden would do just a little more than a photo op, they might actually have a fighting chance. It's almost like Biden is more concerned with offending his corporate buddies like Jay Carney than with the labor rights fight of the century. And it really has become a pattern now, Saagar. I mean, the parallels with Biden saying, like, Amazon, here we come, and then minutes later, Jen Psaki walking it back are too perfect. Now you have, okay, you'll do the photo op, have him in the White House. That's great. That's a nice thing. I'd love to, put that face forward for the country. But at the same time, we're learning that you already betrayed them. You already stabbed them in the back, giving this massive contract to Amazon when your own NLRB has proven and found that they violated labor law multiple times.
They don't care if you have Chris Smalls at the White House if you get the contract. They don't care at all. Yeah, they're like, all right, fine, whatever. They're like, oh, one measly warehouse in Staten Island? They're like, we'll recover. It's $1 trillion company. You know what I mean? This is the thing. If you don't hit them where it hurts, then ultimately you're really not doing anything. And if you're not affecting them on a tax policy or overall making the union environment better, rhetoric I mean, it only means so much.
Yep.
As you saw in the latest election, without structural change and really pressure from the White House, this company cannot and will not change. And we should remember, it is baked into the DNA of Amazon to avoid regulatory scrutiny at all possible. People should go and read the history of the company. They went out of their way to not pay sales tax for more than a decade than after they could have, simply in order to juice profits and not just or simply in order to juice revenue, which they could reinvest back into the company. So people should remember that, and they have tremendous market pricing power over small businesses and many other people across this country.
Very well said. All right, Saagar, what are you looking at?
Well, before I begin, I want to say something clearly. I think actual critical and analytical reporting on Elon Musk, his businesses, his ties to different regimes, and generally how he wants to run Twitter when he eventually takes it over are vital and important. But as always, the biggest problem with our censorship and racial-obsessed press is that they literally do the opposite of that. They sling ad hominem, and in this case, false attacks, which invalidate and possibly even discourage real reporting on the subject. The latest example is truly one of the most disgusting hit pieces that I've seen yet from the New York Times, who wrote, quote, Elon Musk grew up in elite white communities in South Africa, detached from apartheid's atrocities and surrounded by anti-black propaganda. They add, he sees his takeover of Twitter as free speech win, but in his youth did not suffer the effects of misinformation. So what's the takeaway from that? Elon grew up in apartheid South Africa in communities of racists, but by growing up there, he did not suffer from the dangers of racist misinformation. I'm skeptical, but I'm open to it. But per the author of the piece, Musk was sheltered from the disgusting nature of apartheid. And yet, in the very same story, the Times wrote, Musk had non-white friends growing up in South Africa, which is actually pretty courageous considering it was the most racially segregated society on Earth at the time. And in fact, per one of his friends growing up, he was actually bullied by his actually racist classmates for having non-white friends. That friend of his later recalled that Musk was one of the very few whites who even attended the funeral of the man in their family's village at the time. Now look, I've seen some deride this as, yeah, but he has black friends defense. I have a question to pose. How many of the woke people saying that would have had the real courage to have actual non-white friends as a white person in apartheid South Africa, where you have to suffer very real social and economic costs? I think we know the answer, but let's continue on. The second accusation against Elon by the Times is that he grew up in elite white circles protected from the true costs of South Africa, which is interesting because in the exact same piece, they actually quote Musk's own father, who says, quote, as far as being sheltered from it, that's nonsense. They were confronted by it every day, adding they didn't like it. The Times even notes that Musk's father was a member of the anti-apartheid Progressive Party while he was growing up. And finally, in one of the most significant and important facts here, Musk actually left apartheid South Africa to make sure he did not have to serve in the military there, specifically because he did not agree with the racial regime. As Stratechery's Ben Thompson notes, quote, being a liberal with forbidden black friends under a censorious apartheid regime that denied its atrocities is a powerful origin story for Musk's focus on free speech. So powerful, in fact, this takeaway shines through a ham-fisted narrative insinuating the opposite. And that's really the repulsive part. If you read this story, you would have the opposite takeaway of the headline. Of a socially awkward person who had non-white friends, saw the crazy censorship of the apartheid regime, came to the West and to America, and wants to make sure such a system is not in place that resembles anything like that of which he grew up in. Now look, is that the noble intention of Elon Musk? Who knows? That's the real question. That is where the reporting should stay. Insinuating that Musk is some pro-apartheid racist when the facts all literally point to the opposite is repulsive, and we all know why it's being done. It's because of a current censorious nature of Twitter serves elite liberal ends. As Freddie DeBoer so eloquently writes, quote, liberals and leftists are afraid because Twitter is where they perform the personalities that they lack in real life, where they act like the confident and clever people they patently aren't. Ooh, brutal. And absolutely true. The current version of Twitter is to be protected at all costs because it fundamentally is about elite comfort. That is how criticizing somebody became quote-unquote harassment. That's how some stories get allowed and others don't. It's the mindset that leads to these insane feats of so-called journalism when real journalism is sorely needed. And as I pointed out in my own debunking of this article, we should have a lot more of this type of journalism that we saw from the Wall Street Journal in December on Elon Musk's ties to China, his deep reliance on the CCP for the Tesla supply chain, the subsequent reality that Elon could have had a serious problem on his hands if he wants to have Uyghur activists and Hong Kong freedom protesters on that platform. The Chinese have him over the barrel because of choices that he's made with Tesla, which is where the vast majority of his net worth is derived from. Not only that, but Elon has taken out billions of dollars in loans against his Tesla stock, meaning if the Chinese target the stock, they can specifically target his own personal net worth. Or how about this? After Elon tussled with the Saudi royal family on Twitter and stood up to them, why did he then bring in nearly $400 million of Qatari royal family money to help him finance his ownership of Twitter? And in fact, as I said earlier, you remember that Saudi prince that he was jousting with? Well, that prince is going to allow his stock to roll over under Elon and will retain a nearly $2 billion ownership stake in the company. You see, these are the stories that we need. Look, of course, there is some coverage of this, but it is scant and it doesn't dominate the conversation, when really that's the only thing we should be talking about. As always, in the race-obsessed press, in its attempt to take out Elon, has honestly just made him stronger. If you care about real scrutiny of public officials like him, this is the absolute worst possible outcome that you could have. And that's actually something I want to focus on, which is that whenever you have critical reporting of Elon, then people who believe Elon is like some god are like, see, they're always trying to get him. And it's like, you know, actually, I had some of this whenever I talked about CCP and Tesla. I got a bunch of Tesla bros who were coming after me. They're like, you don't understand his grand plan. And I'm like, yeah, maybe, but like, it seems bad. You know?
Right.
These are like,
yeah, we don't know what the grand plan is.
I don't know.
We just know what the facts are.
Yeah, I'm like, I just am looking at facts to the ground and I'm like seeing how previous corporations have suffered from this, and it seems like a really big problem to me. So, you know, you could call me, you know, crazy if you want to, but this makes it so that critical reporting of him becomes somehow aligned with this. And Glenn and my point was, no. We should talk only about the Qataris, the Saudis, the Chinese, about any of these efforts. Let's say also about Elon bringing on, you know, he says he doesn't care about the economics and now he's bringing on billions of dollars. And investors are like, well, that's completely incongruous.
Right.
Which one is it?
Right.
Like, those are the stories to talk about here.
And I think it's also interesting and important to dig a layer deeper, because the whole argument of those who would push more censorship on tech platforms is about, it's often about like, we have to protect, minority voices and historically disadvantaged voices. And there's a lot of language about, oh, what Elon really wants to do is make free speech okay for like white dudes.
Right.
There's, and like enforce white supremacy.
Right.
I mean, the real story that comes out of this narrative they're laying out about South Africa is that it is very important to have free speech rights precisely to protect groups that are disenfranchised and are less powerful. I mean, that's a whole idea of having rights enshrined in a constitution, is to protect them for everyone, especially groups that are marginalized or out of power. And so that's why I have such a visceral reaction to, I have no idea what Elon Musk's upbringing, how it shaped his views. I don't know if the South African racist propaganda and lies is what made him want to genuinely commit to free speech. His own track record on free speech is less than amazing. He's censored his own critics and those sorts of things, and certainly any union activists within Tesla. But you actually should draw the exact opposite conclusion from what they're painting here of it would have been really important to Black people in South Africa to have, to not have propaganda and not have lies and actually have a real, free speech environment. So it is a lesson. There is a parable there for America. It's just the exact opposite of the one that people who are pushing more censorship want you to take from it ultimately.
I completely agree. Just such a completely nuts story. All right, we got a great guest named by Mohamed Younis. Let's get to it. Welcome to the show, Mohamed Younis. He's the editor-in-chief of Gallup. It's great to see you in person, man.
It's great to be back in person.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's put this up there on the screen. How Americans feel about Roe versus Wade. And Mohamed, you are the data master over there at Gallup, and you've got some interesting things to parse with us. So first of all, and I know this is a tough question, how do Americans feel about Roe versus Wade and about abortion? And are the two different subjects?
The second part's hard. The first part's actually really easy because in 1989, 58% of Americans opposed overturning Roe v. Wade. In 2021, you guessed it, 58% of Americans oppose overturning Roe v. Wade. So there's been very little change on people's attitude about the decision itself.
Right.
So that's one thing. The other thing is just how do people feel about abortion generally as a moral issue? When you ask people the question along the very kind of partisan taglines, pro-life, pro-choice, as you can imagine, people split right down the middle. But what's really interesting is that the moral acceptability of abortion, just as a concept that we ask in a list of moral issues, has gone up. And there's been a general trend towards people wanting to see less restrictive, not more restrictive, abortion laws in America. So what I just mentioned are really a compilation of like 6 or 7 questions we've been asking since really the 80s, and more so really in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
And a lot of that time period, we haven't seen a lot of change, but there has been this slight shift towards people wanting to see less restrictive laws, particularly as these cases have come up lately in the last 2 years. So if there's sort of a leaning in public opinion, it's in that direction. But there are a lot of non-traditional sort of left of the aisle, right of the aisle data points to really think about. First of all, only a quarter of Americans really think of abortion as like a voting issue.
Yep.
Right. And that hasn't changed. Only 19% of people who are pro-choice say so. Obviously, that's going to be really interesting. We're actually in the field right now updating all of these questions. So the one thing I'm really looking forward to educating myself on is, has that changed as the president has now asked people to make it a foremost issue? Because it really hasn't been for the left in so long.
Yeah. So is that the case? I mean, the perception generally is that most of the people who vote on abortion are on the right, or on the pro-life side of the debate. Is that accurate? Has that consistently been the case?
It's accurate, but you got to keep in mind that there are very few people that really vote on abortion. Only a quarter or less of Americans say that they basically would only vote for somebody who shares their view on abortion.
See, that's really interesting. How do we parse then the salience of an issue? Like, whenever people say that, how do they exactly rank it? Because we've seen people say before, I only vote on economic issues, but that's just not true. Like, if you go and you look at who they vote for or the general types of things that they prioritize. So how do we parse what people say they want and then how they actually vote come vote time?
And that's a really great question. And not only that, it's where are you voting, right? Because in a lot of places where people are voting, this is not really an issue.
Yeah, true.
It's only in very few districts or states where this issue has really been on the fence in terms of, your vote swinging this way or that way, really making a big difference. If you live in California,
it's not a problem.
It's not going to change.
Right.
But that being said, I think that we really haven't, in our lifetimes, we haven't lived at a time when the President of the United States has brought this front and center to the voting public as an issue to really think about. The other thing is, we shouldn't necessarily assume that everybody who's Republican is going to vote a certain way and Democrat a certain way. It's important to keep in mind that 22% of Republicans describe themselves as pro-choice. And we've seen a few voices from the right coming up and saying, I'm a conservative, but like when it comes to this issue, I have a different view. So I don't think it's a apples to apples kind of comparison for those two factors. One, Republicans are not as monolithic as people assume on being pro-life. And also the public focus now has really shifted towards this issue just months before everybody goes to vote.
Yep.
The other really big factor that is unique in this time is people's attitude about the Supreme Court itself. The Supreme Court just hit a record low in job approval just a few months before all of this happened. Wow. So right now, the Supreme Court is at 40% approval. It was at 58% approval just very recently. So from as somebody with a legal education, it's been really cringeworthy to see those numbers and think about, how the court wants to present itself to the public as above the fray, above political issues, certainly above political leaks. And now this is really happening at a time of extreme concern for the court's job in general. That being said, though, as an institution, it's hurting, and we've had this conversation before. Institutions in America generally have seen a decline in confidence, but the individuals still have a lot of public trust. So Justice Roberts, we asked a question about a series of federal officials. Justice Roberts actually ranked the highest just a few months ago, 60% approval.
Wow.
Justice Ketanji Jackson Brown had the highest in public approval of saying that she should be confirmed just a month ago. So it's not that everybody on the Supreme Court is sort of despised, but the court has really now found itself right in the middle of this political...
Like Congress.
Yeah, I was going to say, people, tend to have a higher opinion of their member of Congress than they do of the body as a whole. Are there generational differences in this issue? Because it is fascinating to me how stable some of these numbers have been. I mean, you pointed out that, 58% of America in, 1989, were opposed to Roe being overturned, and it's still that exact same number. And there have been these changes on the margin. There seem to be, I read a comprehensive study of all the different abortion data over 50 years. There seems to be a somewhat larger group that wants it to be legal in all circumstances, a somewhat smaller group that wants it to be illegal in all circumstances. But overall, opinions have kind of stayed within the same band. Is that because there aren't a lot of generational differences? So as older folks, phase out and new folks come in, it hasn't really changed the composition of how people feel about this issue.
Yeah, there aren't a lot of generations. There are slight changes, of course. Young people are a little more likely, slightly more likely, a few percentage points. But there isn't this big shift between young and old. For example, when you ask about hybrid work, for example, or some of these other social issues that really break along generational lines. So no, we haven't seen that. But we also haven't seen the biggest decision on this policy issue up for grabs in public. So and similarly with the Trump election, we were talking about whether Trump will be reelected. There's so many kind of go-to norms that really don't apply this time around. And that's why I think we really need to keep an open mind with how this issue will play out, not only in the midterms, but also in an environment where inflation is absolutely the number one concern people are thinking about.
I was about to ask you about it. I just saw a Gallup thing this morning about inflation and about the salience in people's lives. Can you tell us about that in terms of the last year and how much top of mind this is?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the questions we ask is, what's the most important problem facing the country? We have not seen inflation or the cost of living mentioned anywhere near this level. Right now, it's about 20% of Americans just volunteer that answer, really since the 80s. It was much higher then, but it's getting there. Where we really see concern is when you ask Americans, do they think inflation will continue for 6 months or longer? And a vast majority of Americans do.
Yeah.
So the outlook is really concerning. Economic confidence index is something that we measure every month. That's now not only gone into the negative, but even further, deeper into the negative. So the economy is very much on people's minds. We saw obviously the market last week had a disastrous week. So whenever that happens, there's going to be a public opinion reaction to them. What will be happening in November, obviously, is so impossible to predict, especially in this era. So, but as the other thing to keep in mind is we shouldn't necessarily assume that this is sort of the end-all be-all decision of the court. We don't really know where the court stands.
That's right.
It is interesting that several of the justices have canceled all of their public speaking engagements pretty much in the next foreseeable future. So you're dealing with a court that really now is very serious, of course, about their image, but is facing a public opinion crisis that they haven't seen in their generation.
Wow.
And then as we move towards the midterms, we played on the show today some of the questions that Republicans are starting to get about specific restrictions. The Missouri governor was being pressed about, their specific law, which doesn't provide any exceptions for rape, incest, or other circumstances. You have in Louisiana, they're advancing a bill that could actually criminalize women and put women in jail who seek abortion. So what do we know about how Americans feel about some of these specific restrictions that have been popular in red states?
It is a very, very low percentage of Americans that actually support that sort of, I won't call it an extreme, but an absolute position. on abortion. So you mentioned earlier, Krystal, it's less than 2 in 10 Americans actually say abortion should be allowed or prevented in all cases. Most people have a much more nuanced position. It's important, though, to keep in mind that these are national public opinion data. So how voters feel in Louisiana is probably a little bit different than that. But again, it is going to be interesting to see how the court deals with really the Pandora's box now that's been opened. Because on a political level, a lot of these laws are going to be put up there simply to kind of kick it through the field goal and see if they can score a touchdown to the Supreme Court. And a lot of what we saw with the Supreme Court's approval rating really dipped when they failed to block. I think it was the Texas law was the first law. And that's when we really saw that movement in the court's approval rating. So not that the court obviously is making decisions based on public opinion. We hope that they're not. And I know that some people think that they are.
I would suggest that they definitely are, but we won't put that on you.
But what is fascinating, I know my law professors are like, what are you doing? But what is fascinating, though, is the decline in approval of the court has been among Democrats, independents, and Republicans. So everybody's mad. They may be mad for different reasons at the court, but everybody's mad at the court right now.
Well, I submit that may be a good thing. Mohamed, we really appreciate you joining us. Thank you, sir.
Great to have you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, and congrats on the digs.
Thanks,
Thank
dude.
you.
Appreciate it. We will see you guys later. Thanks for watching.